Lionel Hale rode into Caldwell, Kansas on the 14th of August, 1878, with $37 in his left boot, a wanted poster with someone else's name folded in his breast pocket, and the absolute ironclad intention of being gone before the sun touched the western ridge. He had been riding for 11 days straight with only short rests, moving northeast from the Oklahoma Territory border, where a job hauling cattle had gone sideways in a way that left 2 men on the ground and Lionel with a very good reason to keep moving. He was not a violent man by nature, but the frontier had a way of pressing a man into shapes he never intended for himself, and Lionel had long since made his peace with that uncomfortable truth. The cattle job had been legitimate, at least at the start. The 2 men on the ground had pulled iron first. Still, questions had a way of following a man, and Lionel had never been fond of questions. Caldwell was a border town, perched right on the edge where Kansas shaded into the Indian Territory to the south. It was 1878, which meant the cattle drives were still churning through in great dusty rivers, and Cowskin Creek still ran clear enough to water a horse without poisoning him. The town itself was a rough collection of frame buildings, most of them unpainted, a few of them still half-finished, as if the carpenters had simply wandered off mid-board and nobody had thought it urgent enough to call them back. There was a livery, a general store, a land office that looked to have been built in a hurry, 2 saloons, a blacksmith shop, and at the far end of the main street, a 2-story building with a freshly painted sign that read Wainwright Boarding House Clean ROOMS, honest prices, no trouble. Lionel read that sign from horseback, squinting against the afternoon glare, and almost smiled. He had a talent for finding trouble even in establishments that specifically advertised against it. He turned his horse, a long-legged roan gelding named Pepper, toward the livery instead and told himself he just needed to rest the horse, water him, maybe buy a feed of oats, and then he would be on his way north to Wichita, where he had heard there was work for a man who could handle himself. The livery boy, a gap-toothed kid of about 14 who introduced himself as Tommy Garrett, took Pepper's reins with the casual confidence of someone who had been handling horses since before he could properly walk. "You passing through, mister?" Tommy asked, already running a practiced hand along Pepper's flank. "That is the plan," Lionel said, pulling his saddlebags off and slinging them over his shoulder. "He needs water first, then oats if you have them. I will be back within 2 hours. "We got good oats," Tommy said. "Came in just last week. Miss Wainwright orders them from a supplier in Wichita. Make sure we got good quality on account of the drovers who come through expecting proper care for their animals." Lionel paused. "Miss Wainwright runs the livery too." Tommy shook his head with something that looked like awe. "Miss Wainwright does not run the livery, but she is the one who told old Mr. Prute 3 years ago that if he kept buying inferior feed, the drovers would stop using him and go to the place over in Wellington instead." Mr. Prute listened. He has not had a slow season since. The boy said this with the tone of someone reciting a piece of local legend that had been repeated so often it had taken on the quality of gospel. Lionel paid for the feed and water, adjusted the weight of his saddlebags, and walked out into the afternoon sun. He needed food. He needed, if he was being honest with himself, about 14 hours of uninterrupted sleep, though he was not going to allow himself that particular luxury. He would eat, he would rest for 2 hours at most, and then he would collect Pepper and ride north. Simple, clean, no complications. He pushed open the door of what looked like the less rowdy of the 2 saloons, a place called the Meridian, and settled himself at a table near the wall where he could see both the front door and the bar. The room smelled of sawdust and old whiskey and the particular kind of tobacco that burned slow and cheap. A few men were scattered at other tables. A bartender with the build of a man who had once been very strong and was now simply large was wiping down the bar with a rag that had likely not been properly cleaned since before the war. Lionel ordered a whiskey, a plate of whatever was hot, and did not volunteer his name to anyone. He was halfway through what turned out to be a serviceable plate of salt pork and boiled potatoes when the door opened and the lights shifted, and something in the room changed in a way he could not immediately name. He looked up. She was not particularly tall. She was perhaps 25, though she carried herself with the kind of quiet authority that made a person's age feel like an irrelevance. Her hair was dark brown, thick, and pinned up in a practical knot that was nevertheless elegant in the way that things are elegant when they are the result of bone structure and bearing rather than effort. She wore a dark green dress that was well-made but clearly a working dress, not a Sunday dress, and she carried a leather-bound ledger under one arm and a basket over the other. Her eyes swept the room with the efficiency of someone who was used to assessing situations quickly and accurately. She walked directly to the bar, set the ledger on the counter, and said to the bartender, "Mr. Donahue, I need to speak with you about the invoice from last month. You still owe Mrs. Perkins for the 3 bushels of corn she delivered, and she is too polite to come to you herself." The bartender, Mr. Donahue, had the expression of a man who had been hoping this conversation was still a few days away. "Miss Wainwright, I have been meaning to. I know you have been meaning to," she said, and her voice was firm but not unkind, carrying that particular quality of a person who is not angry but is not going to pretend not to notice something either. "Mrs. Perkins has 4 children and a leaking roof. Her corn was good quality and delivered on time. I will leave the invoice here with you, and I would appreciate it if you settled it before the week is out." She placed a folded paper on the ledger, picked the ledger back up, and then, as if the matter were entirely settled, turned to go. Her eyes swept the room again in that efficient way, and for a moment they landed on Lionel. He did not look away. He was not sure why. He usually had more discipline than that. She did not look away either, not immediately. She studied him for exactly 2 seconds with that clear, assessing gaze, and then she simply walked out the door. The room seemed slightly smaller after she left. Donahue was shaking his head at the counter in the manner of someone who has been mildly defeated and is mostly fine with it. "That is Inez Wainwright," he said to nobody in particular, though Lionel was the only one looking at him. "Her father built half this town. When he died 2 years ago, most people figured she would sell up and move to one of the cities. She did not sell up." Lionel turned back to his plate. He ate the rest of his meal in silence, paid, left a fair tip, and stepped back out into the August heat. He told himself he was going to the general store for supplies for the ride north, and that was true. He did go to the general store. He bought dried beans, hardtack, a paper of tobacco, though he only smoked occasionally, and 2 cans of preserved peaches, which were a luxury he rarely allowed himself but which he had developed a weakness for somewhere in the years of trail food and necessity. He was standing at the counter paying when the door opened behind him, and he heard that voice again, this time directed at the storekeeper. "Mr. Howell, did the shipment of nails come in?" "Just this morning, Miss Wainwright." "I put aside the 2 kegs you ordered. Thank you, and the glass panes. Week after next, I am told." A small pause. "I will find a way to manage until then." She said it without self-pity, simply noting a fact and moving on the way practical people do. Lionel took his change and his supplies, and as he turned toward the door he nearly walked directly into her. She stepped back. He stepped back. They were perhaps 3 feet apart. Up close her eyes were a shade of brown that was nearly amber in certain light, and there was something in them that was not quite sadness and not quite determination, but was some complex mixture of both that he recognized from the inside out, because he had been carrying something similar in himself for a very long time. "Pardon me," he said. "No harm done," she said. He went to the door. He put his hand on it. And then, because something in him had apparently lost its better judgment, he turned back. "That building at the end of the street," he said. "The boarding house. Do you have a room available for tonight?" She looked at him with that assessing gaze. "Are you the sort of man who causes trouble?" "I try not to be," he said, which was honest. "That is not the same thing as not causing it," she said. "No," he agreed. "It is not." Something shifted in her expression. Not softened exactly, but adjusted, as if she had received information she had not expected and was recalibrating accordingly. "I have a room, 50 cents a night. Supper is included. Breakfast is extra. There is a pump in the yard for washing, and I expect guests to use it before sitting down at the table. No firearms inside except secured in the lockbox in the hallway, and no drinking in the rooms." "Those are fair terms," he said. "They are," she said simply, as if it had never occurred to her that they might not be. He told himself it was just the one night. He needed sleep, and a proper bed with a roof over it would mean better sleep than a couple of hours slumped against a post somewhere, and a better rested man made better time on the trail. He was being practical. He checked into the Wainwright boarding house at 4:30 in the afternoon, stowed his saddlebags in the room, locked his Colt into the hallway lockbox as instructed, and sat on the edge of the narrow but clean bed and stared at the wall. The room was simple but cared for. The curtains were white muslin, clean and pressed. There was a washstand with a ceramic basin and a pitcher of water, a small writing desk with a stub of candle in a tin holder, and a braided rug on the wooden floor that had seen better days but still had color in it. On the wall there was a small framed needlework piece that said, in careful stitches, "Make something of this day." Not a Bible verse, not a proverb. Just a plain directive. He stared at it for a long time. Supper was served at 6 o'clock in the dining room downstairs. There were 3 other boarders at the table. A land surveyor named Collins who was mapping sections east of town, and had the permanently squinting look of a man who spent too much time staring at distant points. A traveling dry goods salesman named Reverdy Pike, who had the cheerful, slightly desperate energy of someone working purely on commission, and a taciturn older man who introduced himself only as Wheeler and who ate with the methodical focus of a person for whom the meal was strictly fuel. Inez Wainwright served the supper herself, with the help of a Mexican woman named Dolores who did the cooking, and clearly had strong opinions about how the biscuits should be arranged on the table. The food was simple and genuinely good: roast chicken, potatoes, green beans that tasted of something other than pure exhaustion, and biscuits that justified Dolores' opinions about their arrangement. Inez sat at the head of the table and ate with the boarders rather than apart from them, which surprised Lionel slightly. She was not distant with the others. She asked Collins about his surveying work with what seemed like genuine interest, endured Reverdy Pike's slightly too enthusiastic account of a new line of manufactured fabric goods with patience, and exchanged a few words with Wheeler about the weather coming down from the north. But she was watchful. She noticed things. When Collins's glass was empty, she refilled it before he'd had the chance to notice it himself. When Pike's enthusiasm began to wear on the older Wheeler, she redirected the conversation with a question so naturally that neither man seemed to notice. She said relatively little to Lionel throughout the meal, but she looked at him twice in ways that were too direct to be casual. After supper, the other boarders dispersed. Collins went back to his room with his maps, Pike went to the Meridian Saloon, and Wheeler went directly to bed with the single-mindedness of the chronically tired. Lionel stayed at the table, partly because he had nowhere in particular to be at 7 in the evening and partly because he was, against his better judgment, not ready to go upstairs. Inez came back from the kitchen and began clearing the remaining dishes from the table. She did not ask him to leave the table. She also did not ask him to stay. She simply worked around him in the pragmatic way of a person who has learned to operate in shared spaces without making everything a negotiation. "How long has the boarding house been here?" he asked, and it came out more naturally than he'd expected, as if the question had been waiting to be asked. She set a stack of plates on the tray and considered him. "My father built it in 1871. He came from Ohio originally, thought Kansas was the future, and he was not wrong about that. He ran it himself until his health declined. I took over managing it when I was 22. How old are you now?" She looked at him with a raised eyebrow that was also somehow a smile. 26, she said. And you? 29, he said. She picked up the tray. You are going north, she said. It was not quite a question. Wichita, he said. There is work up there. There is work here too, she said, not with any particular weight, just stating another fact. She moved toward the kitchen door, then paused without turning around. Caldwell gets its first real cold snap sometime in late October, early November usually. By the time the first snow falls, most of the drovers have moved on and the town is different, quieter. Some people find they prefer it. He did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing. She went into the kitchen. He went upstairs and slept for 9 hours straight, which was the most sleep he had gotten in 3 weeks. In the morning he came downstairs with his saddlebags and his intention of paying for the night and riding out, and he found the breakfast table set, and the smell of coffee so strong and right that he sat down before he had consciously decided to. Inez Wainwright was not at the table. Dolers brought him coffee, eggs, and cornbread, and he ate in silence, listening to the town wake up outside the window. He was putting his hat on when Inez came in from outside with a basket of eggs from what must have been a backyard coop, her hair still not fully pinned up, a few dark strands loose around her face from the morning wind. She stopped when she saw him with his hat and saddlebags. "You are leaving," she said. "I told you I was only staying the one night." "You did," she agreed. She set the basket on the sideboard and turned to look at him with those amber-brown eyes. There was no accusation in them, no attempt to make him feel guilty. She was simply looking at him. She said, "What are you running from?" It was such a direct, uncircumventable question, delivered in such a matter-of-fact tone, that it hit him somewhere under the sternum like a thrown stone. He opened his mouth and nothing came out. He stood there in the doorway of the Wainwright boarding house with his saddlebags over his shoulder and his hat on his head, and found that he had absolutely no answer ready, which was unusual for him, because he usually had several answers ready for most uncomfortable questions, none of them entirely true but all of them functional. "That is what I thought," she said quietly, without cruelty. She picked up the egg basket and walked toward the kitchen. At the door she paused, and this time she did turn around. The Harmon place on the east edge of town needs a roof before autumn comes. The family cannot afford to hire it done properly. I have been trying to find someone who knows what they are doing with timber and shingles. You look like someone who has worked with his hands. He stared at her. "You do not know anything about me." "I know you told the truth when I asked if you caused trouble," she said. "That is more than I know about most of the men who ride through here." He stood there for another 3 seconds that felt considerably longer. "How many days would the roof take?" "4, if the weather holds," she said. "5 if it does not." He set his saddlebags down on the chair beside the door. "I will need lumber." "I will arrange it," she said, and went into the kitchen. He took his hat off and put it on the peg by the door and stood in the hallway looking at the braided rug on the floor, thinking about the question she had asked him. "What are you running from?" He could not remember the last time anyone had asked him that instead of just watching him ride away. He could not remember the last time the answer had mattered to anyone. The Harmon family lived in a small frame house on the eastern edge of town, where the street became a track that became a field. There was James Harmon, who was 43 and had a bad leg from a horse fall 3 years prior that had healed wrong, and his wife Clara, who was 38 and worked at the general store 3 days a week, and their 2 children, a boy of 11 named Robert and a girl of 8 named May. The roof had been failing for 2 seasons. There were places where the light came through in thin lines, and where the rain came through in not-so-thin lines, and the look on Clara Harmon's face when Lionel appeared with lumber the next morning was the kind of look that a person wears when they have been quietly hoping for something for so long they had nearly stopped expecting it. He worked for 4 days on that roof. The weather held for the most part, with only one afternoon of threatening clouds that passed off to the east without delivering on their promises. He was up before dawn each day and did not come down until the light was too far gone to work by. He was methodical and careful, the way his father had taught him, stripping off the old shingles first and checking the underlying boards for rot before anything else, because there was no point in laying good shingles on bad wood. His father had been a carpenter in Tennessee before the war and had talked about the ethics of construction the way other men talked about scripture, with the conviction that bad work was a kind of moral failure. Lionel had not thought about his father in a while. He found himself thinking about him on the second morning, balanced on the peak of the Harmon roof in the early quiet, looking east where the sky was going from black to the deep blue that happens just before the first hint of light, and he thought about how his father would have told him this was good work, solid work, work that would keep a family dry through Kansas winters for years to come. That thought sat in him quietly for the rest of the morning. Inez appeared on the second afternoon, not alone but with a small parcel of sandwiches for himself and young Robert, who had appointed himself Lionel's assistant and was taking the role seriously if not always helpfully. She stood below and looked up at the work with those assessing eyes. "That is well done," she said. "It is not done yet," he said. "I can see when something is being done well," she said. "I do not have to wait for it to be finished." He looked down at her. The afternoon sun was behind her, catching the loose hairs around her face, and she was shielding her eyes with one hand to look up at him, and something about the image lodged itself in his chest like a splinter. "You arranged all of this," he said. "The lumber, the work, you do not even know these people were in need," or he stopped. "You do know them. You know everyone in this town. My father built this town and then he died and left it to me in the way that places get left to people," she said. Not as property, as a responsibility. She said it without resentment, simply explaining a fact about her life. "I do what I can." He wanted to ask her something then, something that was beginning to form in the back of his mind, but Robert handed him a sandwich and the moment passed. On the fourth day the roof was finished. It was straight, solid, watertight, and done in a way that would last. James Harmon shook his hand with the grip of a man who understood physical work and what it meant when it was done right. And Clara brought out a pie apple, with a crust that was genuinely remarkable. And they all sat on the porch in the fading afternoon and ate it together. And Lionel felt something he had not felt in a considerable time, which was the clean, uncomplicated satisfaction of having done exactly what he had set out to do and done it well. He walked back toward the boarding house in the long evening light. Inez was on the front porch when he came up the street, sitting in one of the two wooden chairs with her ledger open on her knees, a pencil in her hand. She looked up. "Finished?" she said. "Finished," he said. He sat down in the other chair, which was not something he had planned to do, it simply happened. They sat for a few minutes in a quiet that was, he realized, genuinely comfortable. Not the silence of two strangers with nothing to say, but the silence of two people who do not need to fill every moment with words. He had not had that kind of silence with another person in so long that he had nearly forgotten it existed. "The Harmon family will not forget that," she said eventually. "They fed me apple pie," he said. "I think we are even." She smiled then, a real smile, not polite or performative, but the kind that comes when something has genuinely caught a person off guard. It changed her face in a way that he stored away somewhere careful. "You said you were going to Wichita," she said. "I did say that." "What is in Wichita?" He thought about it. "Work," he said. "I heard there was work." "What kind of work?" He paused. "The paying kind," he said, and there was something rueful in his voice that he had not intended. She looked at him sidelong. "That is not a very specific plan." "No," he agreed, "it is not." She wrote something in her ledger and said, without looking up, "A man named Gideon Marsh owns the feed supply operation 2 streets over. He has been trying to find a reliable man to manage the wagon runs between here and the rail depot at Wellington, 20-some miles north. It is steady work. It pays reasonably. His last manager left in June to go to Colorado, and he has been running the routes himself, which he is getting too old for." Lionel turned to look at her. "Why are you telling me that?" She looked up from the ledger and met his gaze directly. "Because you are a better carpenter than you are a drifter," she said, and because good people are hard to come by in a town like this." He was quiet for a moment. The evening was coming down around them, the sky going rose and orange to the west, the first star appearing in the deep blue above the eastern horizon. Somewhere down the street, a dog was barking at something with the cheerful incomprehension of a dog that has never once solved the mystery it is barking at. "What makes you think I am a good person?" he asked. He was not being self-deprecating. He genuinely wanted to know what she had seen. She considered the question seriously, which he appreciated. She did not rush to reassure him. "You checked in without complaint about the terms," she said. "You worked 4 days on a stranger's roof without asking what it paid. You ate supper at my table and listened to Reverdy Pike talk about fabric samples for 25 minutes without once cutting him off, even when he was clearly going in circles." She paused. "And when I asked you what you were running from, you stopped. Most men who have nothing to hide do not stop like that. They say nothing, but you stopped because the question meant something to you." He sat with that for a moment. The rose in the western sky was deepening to copper. "It meant something," he admitted. "Do you want to tell me?" she asked, and there was no pressure in it, just an opening. He had not told anyone the full story. He had been carrying it alone for 11 months, since before the cattle job, since before the Oklahoma Territory. He had been carrying it since the night in a town called Beecher's Crossing, where he had made a decision that was the right decision, and that had nevertheless cost him everything he had built for himself up to that point. He told her. Not all of it in one evening, but enough. He told her about the partnership he had entered into in good faith with a man named Crofton, running a small freight operation out of a town in southern Kansas. He told her about the moment he had discovered that Crofton was using the freight wagons to move stolen property, not cattle, which the whole territory seemed to treat as a somewhat flexible moral category, but property taken from a Osage family, whose land was being systematically stripped from them, in ways that were entirely legal on paper and entirely dishonest in practice. He told her about the decision he had made, which was to go to the federal land agent and report what he had seen, and about the way Crofton had reacted to that, which had ended with Lionel's freight business burned to the ground, his savings gone with it, and Crofton walking free because the land agent had been in Crofton's pocket. He told her about the 11 months since then, moving from job to job, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots again, partly because he was trying to stay ahead of Crofton's reach, and partly because somewhere along the way he had stopped believing that staying was something people like him got to do. Inez listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, the sky was fully dark and the stars were sharp and brilliant overhead the way they only are in places far enough from other light. "Crofton," she said, "he is still in business. Last I heard," Lionel said, "and you are afraid he will follow you here." "I am not afraid exactly," he said. "I am careful." "Those are not always different things," she said. He looked at her. "No, I suppose they are not." She closed her ledger and held it in her lap. "Caldwell is not a hiding place," she said. "I want to be clear about that. If this Crofton has reason to come here, he will come here. I will not pretend the town has some kind of protection to offer that it does not." "I know that," he said. "But," she continued, and there was something in her voice that had shifted, become slightly warmer, "a man who does not run from doing the right thing is worth something. In a town that is still deciding what it wants to be, that kind of man is worth something particular." She stood up with her ledger under her arm. "The room is yours for as long as you want it. I will tell you where to find Gideon Marsh in the morning." She went inside. Lionel sat on the porch alone for another half hour, looking at the stars, thinking about what it would mean to stop moving, about whether he still knew how. He went to see Gideon Marsh the next morning. Marsh was a thick-set man of 58 with white hair and the permanently wind-burned complexion of someone who had spent 40 years outdoors. He ran his feed supply operation out of a warehouse on the edge of town, and he was visibly, almost painfully relieved when Lionel walked in and explained that he had heard there was work. "Miss Wainwright sent you," Marsh said. She mentioned the position, Lionel said. Marsh nodded with the satisfaction of a man who has learned not to question certain sources of good fortune. She mentioned it to you, which means she thinks you are reliable, he said. That carries weight with me. Sit down, let us talk terms. The terms were straightforward. The wagon runs to Wellington and back, twice a week, hauling feed supplies both ways and sometimes bringing back goods for the general store. The pay was $1.50 per run, which was fair, plus a small commission on any new supply accounts Lionel could bring in from the farms and ranches along the route. He would have the use of a company wagon and a team of 2 draft horses that needed feeding and care, but were not his financial responsibility. He took the job. He told himself that he was taking it because it was the sensible, practical thing to do, and because Wichita was a city with too many eyes and too many men who had worked cattle drives and might recognize him from that mess in the Oklahoma Territory. He told himself that Caldwell was a more strategic place to be right now, less visible, less complicated. He told himself several things that were true but that were also, he was slowly beginning to understand, not the whole truth. The whole truth was that he could not stop thinking about the way Inez Wainwright had said a man who does not run from doing the right thing is worth something, and about the splinter feeling in his chest when he had looked down from the Harmon roof and seen her shielding her eyes with her hand. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that was unlike anything he had known in the previous 11 months. The runs to Wellington were long days but satisfying ones, and he was good at the work in a way that surprised even him, good at the logistics, at remembering which farms needed what and when, at building the kind of easy, reliable rapport with the ranchers and farmers along the route that made them call for Marsh's supply wagon without having to think about it. Marsh was pleased with him in the way that a man is pleased when something he hoped for turns out to be exactly what it appeared. He ate supper most evenings at the boarding house table. Collins the surveyor wrapped up his work and left in September, and a young couple from Missouri named Aldrich came to take the larger room for a few weeks while they looked for land to buy. The house was rarely full but rarely empty, and Inez managed it with the same quiet, unhurried competence she brought to everything. He and Inez fell into the habit of talking in the evenings, sometimes on the porch, sometimes at the cleared supper table after the other boarders had gone to their rooms. It was not a courting ritual in any formal sense. There were no deliberate gestures, no flowers, no arranged visits. It was simply conversation, steady and honest, building on itself day by day the way that good things build. She told him about her father, a man named George Wainwright who had come west with the optimistic conviction of the mid-century immigrant, and had built a solid life out of Kansas red clay through sheer force of competent intention. He had not been a warm man exactly, but he had been a fair one, and Inez had inherited from him both the boarding house and a certain relationship with fairness that ran bone deep. She had not had a mother since she was 12. Her mother had died of a fever that swept through the territory and took the weak and the unlucky alike, and that loss sat in Inez as a quiet thing, not a wounding thing anymore, just a shape in the room. She had been engaged once, at 20, to a man named Peter Haas who had seemed solid and good, and had turned out to be neither of those things in ways that emerged slowly and disappointingly rather than dramatically. He had gone to Denver in 1874, and she had not heard from him since. She spoke about it with the detachment of someone who has had time to understand a thing fully and is no longer hurt by it, only occasionally weary. Lionel told her more of his own history in pieces, over those evenings. He told her about growing up in Tennessee, about his father's carpentry work, about the war that had taken his father and left his mother to manage a farm she was not physically equipped to manage alone, and about the years after when he had moved west because east felt too heavy with things that couldn't be fixed. He had worked cattle for several years, which was where he had learned what it meant to sleep under the open sky and to rely on nothing but himself and the horse under him. He had tried to settle twice before and it had not taken, once in Abilene and once in a small settlement in the Indian Territory that was being built on ground that had been promised to the Cheyenne, and that Lionel had eventually left because he could not stop seeing the wrongness of it every time he looked at the land around him. "You have a strong conscience," Inez said one evening, and she said it without any irony or complication, just a plain statement. "It has cost me more than it has paid," he said. "That is usually the way with consciences," she said. "It does not make them less worth having." He looked at her and thought, not for the first time, that she was one of the clearest people he had ever met. Not simple, she was far from simple, but clear in the way that water is clear when it is deep and clean, so you can see all the way to the bottom. In early September, trouble arrived in the form of a man named Dale Prout. Prout rode in on a Tuesday afternoon and went directly to the Meridian Saloon, which was where strangers who were not interested in a clean room and honest prices tended to go first. He was a tall, narrow-shouldered man with a sandy beard who worked for Crofton, though it took Lionel a day and a half to confirm that. Prout had not been sent to do violence, or at least that was not primarily his purpose. He had been sent to find Lionel and report back on his location, which in some ways was worse, because it meant Crofton was still paying attention. Lionel knew about Prout on the Wednesday morning when Tommy Garrett came running to the warehouse to tell him that there was a man in the Meridian asking about a tall fellow who did freight work and had come up from the Oklahoma Territory. Tommy had heard this from the blacksmith's apprentice who had heard it from the saloon swamper, and the chain of information was entirely typical of small frontier towns where people knew each other's business whether they wanted to or not. Lionel thanked Tommy, finished loading the Wellington wagon, and spent the rest of the morning driving to Wellington and back with a careful, methodical mind. He had known this was possible. He had been careful, but Crofton was not a man who gave up on a grievance easily, and 11 months was not long enough for a man like Crofton to let go of the fact that Lionel had cost him a federal investigation, even one that had ultimately come to nothing. He came back from Wellington in the late afternoon and went directly to Inez. He found her in the small office at the back of the house where she kept her accounts, and he told her about Prout. She listened with her hands folded on the desk, not tensing, not alarmed, simply receiving the information. When he finished, she said, "Do you want to leave?" The question was asked with complete evenness. There was no pressure in it either way. She was not asking him to stay. She was not pushing him to go. She was simply asking what he wanted. He realized, sitting across the desk from her in that small office with the September light coming through the window and the ledgers arranged in their neat rows on the shelf behind her, that the question of what he wanted had not been a question he had taken seriously in a very long time. He had been operating on the basis of what was necessary, what was strategic, what was survivable. What he wanted had felt like the kind of question that belonged to people with the luxury of staying. "I do not want to leave," he said. Something shifted in her face. Small, controlled, but he had learned to read the small, controlled shifts. "Then we deal with it," she said. Dealing with it turned out to be simpler than he had feared. Inez, who knew everyone and whom everyone was at least mildly wary of disappointing, had a conversation with the town sheriff, a steady man named Frank Aldridge who had a complicated past of his own and a straightforward present. She told Aldridge that a man named Prout was in town asking questions on behalf of a former business associate of Mr. Lionel Hale's, who had committed fraud against a federal land agent process, and that Mr. Hale had been the complainant in that case and had nothing to answer for. She presented this information without drama and with the clear implication that she expected Aldridge to take note of it. Aldridge, who was the kind of lawman who had survived in the borderland between Kansas and the Territory by knowing precisely which hills he could afford to die on and which ones he could not, went to the Meridian that evening and had a conversation with Dale Prout. Nobody who was there reported exactly what was said, but Prout rode out the next morning and did not come back. Lionel found out about this not from Inez directly but from Marsh, who had heard it from Aldridge, who apparently had no particular interest in keeping it quiet. He went to find Inez and found her in the garden behind the house, where she kept a small kitchen garden that was in its late-season abundance, heavy with the last tomatoes and the winter squash that were just beginning to turn. "You spoke to Aldridge," he said. "I did," she said. She was kneeling by the tomato plants, a basket beside her, and she looked up at him without the shielding hand this time because the afternoon sun was behind him. "You did not tell me you were going to do that." "I did not know if it would work," she said. "I did not want to give you the expectation of a solution that might not be one, but it seemed worth trying." He crouched down to her level, which put them nearly eye to eye. "Inez," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name just like that without the miss in front of it, and he was aware of it the moment it came out. She was aware of it too. She was still the way she went still when something was registering. "You did not have to do that," he said. "I do not have a claim on this place. You could have let him find me and saved yourself the complication." She looked at him steadily. "I know I did not have to," she said. "I wanted to." He reached out and picked up a late tomato from the basket and turned it over in his hands for something to do with himself. "Why?" he asked quietly. She sat back on her heels and looked at him directly with those amber-brown eyes that never seemed to look away from anything. "Because you came into my dining room and listened to Reverdy Pike for 25 minutes and fixed the Harmon roof and told me the truth about Crofton when you did not have to," she said. "And because every evening when I sit down to talk with you, I look forward to it more than anything else I have done all day, and I have been aware of that for some weeks now." She said it simply, without decoration, the way she said most things, but her voice was not quite as steady as usual. He set the tomato back in the basket. He was very close to her. The garden smelled of late summer and warm earth. "I think about you when I am on the road to Wellington," he said. "I think about what you would say about the things I see. A herd of pronghorn moving along a ridgeline. The way the sky looks before a storm out in the open. I compose conversations with you in my head, and then I come back and have to remind myself not to start them mid-thought because from my perspective, they have already been going on for 40 miles. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. "What have we talked about?" "Politics," he said. "The federal land policy mostly. I get very worked up about it." She did laugh then, properly, and it was a sound he decided in that moment he would like to be responsible for as often as possible. He reached out and touched her hand just lightly, where it rested on the edge of the basket. She turned her hand over and held his. They stayed like that in the garden for a long minute, not speaking, the late August heat settling around them, the tomatoes heavy on their vines, and something that had been building for weeks finally becoming simply what it was. He said, "I have not been a man who stayed for a long time." "I know," she said. "I am trying to remember how to be one." "I think," she said, squeezing his hand briefly, "you have been doing it for a month already without quite noticing." October came in clean and cool, with the particular quality of light that the Great Plains produce in autumn, a horizontal, golden, quietly astonishing light that makes even the most ordinary things look as if they are being paid close attention. The cattle drives had thinned out by the first week of the month. The last of the big herds pushed through on their way to the rail depots, leaving the town with the quieter, more settled feeling that Inez had described back in August. Lionel and Inez were, by general agreement of the town of Caldwell, a pair, though neither of them had made any announcement about it. It was simply understood the way things are understood in small towns, through the evidence of daily observation. The way they walked together to the church on Sunday mornings, not because either of them was particularly devout, but because it was the social center of the community and Inez had responsibilities to that community. The way he had begun helping her with the heavier maintenance work around the boarding house without being asked. The way she kept a tin of coffee ready in the kitchen at the hour he returned from the Wellington run, which was a small specific act of care that meant, in the calculus of frontier life, rather a great deal. He had moved his remaining belongings properly into the boarding house room. Not just his saddlebags, but the small accumulation of things that a man gathers when he starts believing he might be somewhere for a while. A second pair of boots he had bought at the general store, a few books, a battered copy of Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel, and a field guide to Great Plains plant life that he had found at the Wellington Trading Post and been delighted by. A coffee mug he had bought at the potter's stall at the October market. The October market was a quarterly event in Caldwell, set up on the main street on a Saturday, with traders and farmers from the surrounding area bringing in goods, and Lionel went with Inez and found it entirely pleasant in a way that domestic pleasantness had not been for him in years. They walked the stalls together, she with her ledger. The ledger seemed to go most places she went, which he found endearing, and he with his hands in his pockets, and they tasted preserves and argued mildly about whether the butter at the far-end stall was genuinely better than what the general store carried, and he bought her a small jar of wild plum jam from a woman who had made it from plums gathered along Cowskin Creek. And she looked at the jar, and then at him, with an expression that was both amused and pleased. He had written a letter to the Federal Land Office in Topeka in September, with Inez's encouragement, documenting what he had witnessed with Crofton and the Osage family's land. The Osage people had been repeatedly subjected to treaty violations and land grabs throughout this period, and Lionel had understood, even when he had first reported it, that the machinery of the federal government was not particularly interested in prioritizing their rights. But Inez had argued with her characteristic clear-eyed persistence that the record mattered even when the immediate outcome was uncertain, that putting things into the formal record was not nothing, that it was part of how wrongs eventually got named even when they could not yet be righted. He had written the letter. He had written it carefully and completely, naming everything he had seen. He did not expect a swift resolution. He was not naive about what the federal government's relationship with the Osage had been and continued to be. But writing the letter had felt like something, like restoring a piece of himself he had not quite realized he had lost in the 11 months of running. In the middle of October, Reverdy Pike came back through town on his sales circuit and stayed 3 nights, and Lionel sat at the supper table and listened to him talk about fabric samples with a patience that was, this time, genuinely without effort. Inez caught his eye across the table, and the shared understanding in her gaze was one of the best things he had felt all month. The night after Pike left, they were on the porch again. It was colder now, the evenings carrying the edge of what was coming, and Inez had brought a shawl. The stars were even sharper in the cooling air. "I need to tell you something," he said. "All right," she said, attentive. "When I rode into this town," he said, "I had no intention of staying. I told myself it was one night, then one roof, then one run to Wellington to see if the job was worth the trouble. I kept telling myself I had a reason that was just the one reason, and then that reason would be done and I would go." "I know," she said. "I think the real reason I stayed," he said, "is that you asked me that question in the morning before I could leave, and I did not have an answer, and I found that I wanted to be the kind of man who had an answer, a real one." He turned to look at her. "I am not all the way there, but I am closer than I have been in a long time." She turned to look at him too. In the cold autumn air, her breath made a small cloud. The shawl was pulled around her shoulders, and her dark hair was down, which it sometimes was in the evenings, and he thought she was the most beautiful thing he had seen in his entire life, not in the way of an abstraction or a painting, but in the specific particular way of a person you know. A person whose laugh and whose silences, and whose habit of carrying a ledger everywhere, and whose way of refilling a glass before anyone knows it needs refilling you have memorized completely. "Lionel," she said, and his name in her mouth was a different thing entirely than it was anywhere else. "I love you," he said. He said it the way he did most things now, simply and without armor. "I'm aware that this is not a sophisticated declaration. I'm aware that I arrived here with $37 and a bad plan and no qualifications to offer a woman like you anything except my honest intention. But I love you, and I intend to stay, and I wanted to say it plainly." She was quiet for one moment that he felt in his full body. Then she said, "I love you too." And she said it in that direct, undecorated way she had, and it landed with more force than any elaborate statement could have. "I have been in love with you since approximately the third evening we sat at this table," she added, with a slight dryness that was entirely characteristic, "and I have been waiting for you to catch up." He laughed, and it was the most unguarded laugh he had produced in recent memory. "You could have said something. You needed to find it yourself," she said. "Some things cannot be given to a person. They have to be arrived at." He reached across and took her hand, which by now was something that happened naturally, easily, with none of the careful deliberateness of the first time in the garden. "I arrived," he said. "You did," she agreed. He kissed her then on that cold October porch, under the sharp Kansas stars, and she kissed him back with the same quality of honest directness that characterized everything she did, and it was nothing like being uncertain. It was nothing like running. November came. The sky over Caldwell grayed and lowered, and the nights got properly cold, and the boarders wore heavier coats to supper, and dolers began adding a second log to the kitchen fire at all hours, and muttering about Kansas winters in a way that made it clear she had strong opinions about them despite having lived through several. The cattle drovers were entirely gone now, and the town had the quieter, more inward feel of a community settling in for the cold months. Lionel had, by this point, made himself genuinely useful to Caldwell in ways beyond the Wellington run. He had repaired the schoolhouse window that had been letting wind in since spring. He had helped Gideon Marsh negotiate a better arrangement with the Wellington Rail Depot that would save the supply operation money on storage fees. He had started going to the town meetings that were held at the church hall on the first Monday of each month, because Inez went, and he found he was interested in the decisions being made about the town's future, which was a feeling so different from his previous relationship with towns that he sometimes looked up in the middle of a meeting and was briefly startled to find himself there. He had also been thinking about something for several weeks that he had not yet said out loud, and which he finally said one gray Thursday afternoon when he came back from the Wellington run to find Inez in the garden, not gardening this time. The garden was finished for the season, put to bed under a layer of straw, but simply standing looking at the bare rows with the particular look of someone thinking about next spring. He said, "I want to marry you." She turned around. She had not heard him come up behind her, and the surprise on her face was genuine, which was unusual for her. Then the surprise settled into something softer and more radiant. "That is not a question," she said. "No," he agreed. "I was working up to the question. I wanted to say the statement first so you would know I meant it without condition." She looked at him with those eyes that he would spend the rest of his life looking back into. "All right," she said. "Now ask the question." "Inez Wainwright," he said, and he was aware that his voice was not quite steady, which was also unusual for him. "Will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, immediately and without equivocation, because that was who she was. "Yes." Obviously, yes. He took her face in his hands and kissed her in the November garden, and she laughed against his lips, which he had learned was something she did when she was happier than she had expected to be. They were married on the 22nd of November, 1878, in the Caldwell church, which was small and cold and decorated for the occasion with dried corn husks and late chrysanthemums in yellow, and rust that dolers had procured from somewhere with characteristic determination. The minister was a man named Reverend Coles, who was lean and serious, and clearly moved by the occasion despite himself. Sheriff Aldridge was there, and Gideon Marsh with his wife, and the Harmon family, and Tommy Garrett from the livery in a jacket that was too big for him and very obviously borrowed, and a full half of the town of Caldwell besides, because the town had been watching this particular story develop with the interest of people who have seen a great many things go badly, and wanted to see one go well. Inez wore a dress of deep blue wool that she had made herself, which he would learn only later was a piece of deliberate choice blue for clear water. She told him later, for things being visible all the way to the bottom. He wore his one good suit, which was dark gray and respectable, and he had polished his boots to a standard he had not attempted since his mother was alive to notice such things. He was nervous for the first time in years, which felt like a kind of aliveness, the good kind. She walked down the aisle on the arm of James Harmon, because she had no family left, and he had offered with such genuine warmth that she had accepted. When she reached the front of the church and took Lionel's hands, she looked up at him, and her eyes were bright in a way that was close to tears but was really not sadness at all. It was the feeling of arriving somewhere you have been trying to get to for a long time. He said his vows in a clear voice, looking at her, meaning every word with a straightforwardness that he hoped the assembled town of Caldwell would witness and remember. She said hers in her usual direct manner, with that quality of total unambiguity that he had been falling in love with since the first morning, when she had asked him what he was running from. Outside the church afterward, in the cold November air that smelled like wood smoke and the first real winter coming down from the north, the town celebrated with the wholehearted enthusiasm of a community that does not have enough occasions for celebration and makes the most of the ones it gets. There was food, remarkable amounts of food, contributed by what seemed like everyone in Caldwell. Clara Harmon's apple pie making an appearance that was received with the reverence it deserved, and music from a fiddle player named Jeb Stokes who had 3 good songs, and played them repeatedly without anyone objecting, and laughter, and the particular warmth of people who live hard lives, pausing to acknowledge something worth acknowledging. Lionel stood with his arm around his wife's shoulders and looked at the people of the town he had ridden into intending to leave by nightfall, and thought about the distance between intention and outcome, and about how sometimes the best possible thing that can happen to a man is to find that he cannot answer a simple question. The first snow fell on November 29th, a week after the wedding. It came overnight quietly, so that when Lionel woke in the gray pre-dawn and looked out the window of what was now their room together, the world outside had been transformed into the clean white silence of the season's first covering. The garden was white. The street was white. The rooftops were white, including, he could see from the window if he looked east, the roof of the Harmon house, which sat snug and sealed against the weather under its new shingles. Inez was still asleep, her dark hair spread against the pillow, and he looked at her for a moment the way a person looks at the evidence of an improbable good fortune before going to heat the coffee on the small iron stove that had been installed in their room against the winter. When she woke and came to stand beside him at the window, wrapped in the quilt, he put his arm around her and they watched the snow together in silence. "First snow," she said. "I am still here," he said. She turned her head and looked up at him with that small, complete smile, the one he had been learning to recognize as entirely his. "I noticed," she said. "Winter in Caldwell was not the gentle season." The January storms came in off the plains with a fury that was entirely impersonal, piling snow against the boarding house walls, and turning the street into an impassable drift for days at a time. And the cold was the kind that gets through every layer you put on and settles in your bones with the patience of something that knows it will eventually win. The Wellington runs were suspended during the worst of it, which meant less money coming in, and Inez ran the boarding house through December and January with the careful management of resources that was both her nature and a practical necessity. But there was something in the winter, something that surprised Lionel, which was how the enforced proximity of the cold months changed things. They were inside together more than they had been in autumn, in the evenings by the iron stove in the sitting room, and they talked more fully and freely than they had before, as if the narrowing of the world that winter brought had concentrated something rather than reducing it. He read aloud to her sometimes from Harriet Beecher Stowe, and she would make corrections to her accounts at the same time, and the domestic ordinariness of it was a thing he kept having to remind himself to receive without astonishment. He wrote again to the Federal Land Office in Topeka in January, a second letter about the Crofton situation, this time with more detail about the specific land parcels and the specific Osage family affected. He had, through correspondence that Inez had helped him initiate, been in contact with a young attorney in Topeka named Samuel Bright, who had an interest in Indian land rights cases, and who thought there might be grounds for a formal inquiry if sufficient documentation could be assembled. It was slow, uncertain work, and Lionel did not expect it to resolve quickly or definitively. But he kept at it with the same persistence that characterized everything he had come to understand was important, because Inez had been right that the record mattered. By February, the coldest months beginning to loosen their grip just slightly, Inez told him quietly one evening with her characteristic straightforward manner that she believed she was expecting a child. He went very still for a moment, the kind of still that is not absence but the opposite, a fullness of everything happening at once. Then he said, "Are you sure?" "I am fairly sure," she said. "Dollars is completely sure. She has 8 children. I have found her certainty on this subject to be reliable." He took her hands in his. He looked at her. He said, "Are you happy about it?" She looked back at him steadily. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" "Yes," he said, and it came from somewhere so deep and genuine that he did not even pause on it. "Yes." He held her for a long time in the sitting room while the stove ticked, and the wind moved outside, and the winter continued its slow, reluctant retreat from the Kansas plains. Spring came back as it always does, definitive and generous, green pushing through the brown in a way that managed to be surprising every year despite being inevitable. The boarding house came alive again with the returning traffic of drovers and travelers and land seekers, who were heading for the territory with that mixture of hope and ignorance that characterized the era's westward movement. Lionel resumed the Wellington runs and was back in Marsh's good graces after the long winter suspension, and Marsh had, in the meantime, been so pleased with the accounts Lionel had built along the route that he had offered him a formal partnership arrangement, a share in the business in exchange for continued management of the supply routes and the client relationships. Lionel accepted. He sat across from Marsh and signed the papers with the feeling of a man putting his name to something that would last, something he intended to honor and build, and the feeling was new, and it was not frightening, not at all. The baby arrived in October of 1879, 14 months after Lionel had ridden into Caldwell intending to leave by nightfall. He was a boy, solid and emphatic from the first moment, with Lionel's dark eyes and Inez's fierce way of looking at everything. They named him George, for Inez's father, which seemed right. Lionel sat in the chair by the bedroom window in the gray October dawn, holding his son while Inez slept, exhausted and deeply, peacefully composed in the way of someone who has done a hard thing and done it well. George was asleep too, making small, indignant sounds even in sleep as if he already had opinions about his situation. Lionel looked out the window at the main street of Caldwell, at the frame buildings and the dirt street, and the livery where Tommy Garrett was just visible beginning his morning work, at the sign on the boarding house that said clean ROOMS, honest prices, no trouble, and thought about the man who had ridden into this street 15 months ago with $37 in his boot and a wanted poster in his pocket, and the ironclad intention of being gone by nightfall. That man had been someone who had given up on staying without knowing he had given up, who had been moving so long he had confused motion with freedom and distance with safety. That man had needed a woman to ask him one simple question that he could not answer and would not be able to stop thinking about until he had earned the right to answer it honestly. He looked down at his sleeping son. He thought about his own father, who had died when Lionel was 16, who had worked with wood all his life and built solid things that outlasted the building of them, who had told him that the measure of a man's life was not the miles he covered, but the quality of what he left standing. He had been trying to understand that for 13 years and thought he was, finally, beginning to understand it properly. Spring of 1880 brought several things worth noting. Samuel Bright, the Topeka attorney, wrote to report that the formal inquiry into the land transactions involving Crofton and the Osage family's acreage had been opened, that Crofton's name was now formally associated with a pattern of fraudulent land dealings that 3 other witnesses had come forward to corroborate, and that while the legal process would be long and the outcome uncertain, there was genuine reason to believe that some form of accountability was possible. He also wrote that Crofton had closed his freight operation and moved to Denver, apparently having concluded that remaining in southern Kansas was no longer strategically comfortable. Lionel read the letter twice and then gave it to Inez and watched her read it and saw the satisfaction move across her face. "It is not enough," she said, setting the letter down. "No," he agreed, "it is not, but it is something." "It is something," he said. "You were right about the record." She folded the letter neatly and placed it in the drawer where she kept important papers. "I usually am," she said, without vanity, simply noting a statistical observation. He smiled. "Usually," he said. By the summer of 1880, Marsh's supply operation had grown sufficiently that they brought on a second driver, a reliable young man from Wellington named Curtis Hayes, who had grown up hauling farm goods and knew the roads between the 2 towns in the way that comes from many years of covering the same ground. This freed Lionel to spend more time on the business side, the accounts and the arrangements, and the occasional trip to Wichita to negotiate with the rail depot agent for better freight terms. He found he was good at it in a way that surprised him, the same way carpentry had surprised him with how satisfying it was to do well, the satisfaction of work that required both skill and reliability in equal measure. George, by his first birthday in October of 1880, was walking with the determined, lurching confidence of a child who has been upright for all of 3 weeks and is already fully committed to the method. He had a powerful opinion about everything, expressed primarily through a combination of pointed looks and emphatic sounds, which Clara Harmon said was exactly Inez in miniature, and which Inez herself could not entirely deny. Tommy Garrett from the livery, who was 16 now and growing rapidly, had become something of an unofficial fixture in the Hale household, appearing several evenings a week for supper with the uncomplicated regularity of a young person who has found a place they feel welcome and has decided to use it thoroughly. Lionel had, without any formal announcement of the role, become a kind of mentor to him, teaching him the bookkeeping side of stable management and the basics of what a working knowledge of the freight business required. Tommy absorbed it all with the gap-toothed enthusiasm that was his primary characteristic, and that Lionel had come to find genuinely warming. In the spring of 1881, Inez told him she was expecting their second child. This time the news came after supper, with George asleep upstairs and the evening quiet settled around the house, and Lionel received it with the particular joy of a man for whom good fortune had, through the exercise of staying and building and earning, become something that arrived steadily rather than accidentally. "Another one," he said. "Another one," she agreed, with that smile that was still, after 3 years, capable of reorganizing everything in his chest. "A girl, perhaps," he said. "Perhaps," she said, "though George will likely have opinions about that." "George has opinions about everything," he said. "He gets it from his mother. He certainly did not get it from a man who rode into town intending to leave by nightfall and then signed a business partnership and married the first woman who asked him a difficult question," she said. He reached across and touched her face. "It was a very good question," he said. "It was a very simple question," she said. "Simple and good are often the same thing," he said. She turned her head and pressed her lips briefly against his palm. "I am glad you stayed," she said, and it was as simple and complete a statement as anything she had ever said, which was saying something. "I am glad you asked," he said. The second child was born in October of 1881, a boy again, red-faced and loud and entirely himself from the first moment. They named him James, for James Harmon, who had walked Inez down the aisle and who had by this point become what he simply was, which was family. James Harmon himself, informed of this honor, had to sit down on the boarding house porch steps and collect himself for several minutes, and Clara Harmon cried in the way that people cry when they are purely happy. Caldwell in 1880, one was different from Caldwell in 1878, though not unrecognizably so. The town had grown, carefully, with the steady accumulation of people who came west looking for land and staying because they found community. The boarding house had been expanded by half again, a wing added on the south side that Lionel and James Harmon had built together over the course of the previous summer, with Tommy Garrett as assistant and George Hale, aged nearly 2, as interested if entirely unhelpful observer. It was a well-built wing, solid and properly joined, done in the manner that Lionel's father had taught him, with the understanding that bad work was a kind of moral failure. The cattle drives were changing. The heyday of the long drives through Caldwell would not last much longer. The railroads were pushing further south and west, and the economics of the drives were shifting. Lionel and Marsh had seen this coming and had adjusted the supply business accordingly, expanding into general freight hauling and away from the pure dependence on the cattle trade, so that when the changes came, they were positioned for them rather than overwhelmed by them. The Wellington Depot agent, a man named Carver who had initially viewed Marsh's operation with the barely concealed disdain that railroad men of the period tended to reserve for anyone not working for the railroad, had eventually come around, partly because Lionel had proven to be the kind of reliable, honest business partner who eventually defeats disdain through sheer consistency, and partly because Inez had, at the joint Christmas gathering of the town's business community in December of 1880, asked Carver a series of quiet, penetrating questions about the depot's capacity planning that had left him visibly impressed and subsequently much more willing to negotiate in good faith. In November of 1882, a letter arrived from Samuel Bright in Topeka, reporting that the formal inquiry into the Crofton land transactions had concluded with a finding of fraud, that Crofton's activities had been ruled a violation of the terms under which the land had been managed, and that, while the Osage family in question had not been fully restored to their original position, there had been a settlement that included financial compensation and a formal acknowledgement of the fraudulent nature of the transactions. Bright wrote that this was not justice, not completely, and that the larger patterns of which Crofton's case was only one small example continued with the weight of federal policy behind them. But Lionel's documentation had made a difference to one specific family, and that was recorded and real. Lionel read the letter and then walked to the cemetery at the edge of town where he sometimes went to think. He stood for a while in the November afternoon, in the same quality of light he had first arrived in, horizontal and golden, and paying close attention to everything. He thought about the Osage family whose name he had never learned, whose land had been at the center of a legal process that had ground on for 4 years. He thought about what Inez had said, that the record mattered even when justice was incomplete. He thought about the distance between what could be done and what should be done, and about the importance of continuing to close that distance even when the work was slow. He came home in the early evening to the boarding house, which was warm and lit from within against the November dark. He could see through the front window the lamp in the sitting room, and the shape of Inez at her desk, the ledger still, always the ledger, and the smaller shapes of George and James in the corner where they had a collection of wooden toys that Lionel had made for them over several evenings. Simple things, a horse, a wagon, a set of blocks, made with the same care he put into anything built to last. He stood on the porch for a moment before going in, looking at the sign that said Wainwright Boarding House Clean ROOMS, honest prices, no trouble. The sign needed repainting. He had been meaning to do it before winter. He made a mental note to do it on the next clear day. He went inside. George came running from the corner with the immediate, totalizing enthusiasm of a 3-year-old for whom the arrival of his father was an event of the first order. Lionel swung him up, and George announced several things in rapid succession about the wooden horse, about something that had happened involving James and a biscuit, and about the general situation with the blocks. Inez looked up from the ledger. Her face did what it did, the thing that happened when he came in, the slight opening, the warming that was entirely for him. He carried George to the desk and leaned down and kissed her. "Good letter," she said, because she had known it was coming. "Better than nothing," he said. "Less than everything. That is usually how it goes," she said. "Yes," he said, and set George down, who immediately ran back to his brother. "But I want to tell you about it properly, after the boys are down." "I will save the coffee," she said. He took his coat off and hung it on the peg by the door, the peg where his hat had been hanging since the morning in August 4 years ago when he had put it there and not taken it back down again. He looked at it for a moment. This coat on a peg in a house that was his, in a town that was his, in a life that was his in the way that a life only becomes when a person stops running and starts building. He picked up James from the corner, which James accepted with the tolerant good nature of a second child, and went to sit by the stove, and the evening came down outside the windows, and the boarding house settled into its nighttime sounds, and his family was around him, and the first snow of the season was, if the smell of the north wind was anything to go by, not far away. The years moved the way years do when a life is full, each one shorter in memory than the last but richer in what it held. George, at 5, showed the same talent for careful observation that his mother had, the way of noticing things, and holding them in a patient regard before speaking, which made him both a thoughtful child and a slightly unnerving one, because you were never quite sure what he was about to say. James, at 4, was his opposite in temperament but his equal in intelligence, all movement and immediate response, a child who had opinions in the instant and announced them with clarion confidence. Inez had, by 1883, expanded the boarding house operation to include a small restaurant open to the public for the noon meal, which dolers had embraced with such ferocity that it had quickly become the best-regarded eating establishment in Caldwell, which was not a town that lacked for competition on that front. It was practical. It supplemented the boarding house income during the winter months when fewer travelers were on the road, and it gave Dolers, who was an artist of the kitchen trapped in a frontier town's supply constraints, a larger stage. Lionel, by 1883, was the effective operating partner of what had become Marsh and Hale Freight and Supply, Gideon Marsh having retired in fact if not in name, coming into the office 2 days a week to smoke his pipe and share opinions about the industry, which Lionel found valuable. Tommy Garrett, 19 now and fully grown into his responsible and capable self, had come to work for them full-time, managing the stable end of the operation with a competence that had long since outgrown anything Lionel had taught him and developed its own authority. Sheriff Aldridge had been reelected twice on the strength of a record that included both effective law enforcement and a principled resistance to the kind of casual violence that characterized some of the border towns to the south. He and Lionel had become, not close friends exactly, but the kind of steady, mutually respectful associates who know each other's worth. In 1884, a third child arrived, a girl this time, born in April when the plains were just coming green. They named her Clara, for Clara Harmon, which made Clara Harmon cry again, for exactly the same reasons as before. Clara Hale was, from the beginning, the child who looked like Lionel, with his dark eyes and his particular quality of stillness, and who had her mother's directness of gaze, so that looking at her was like looking at both of them at once in a way that he found quietly astonishing every time. He was in the garden when Inez, recovered and sitting in the sunshine with Clara asleep in her arms, said to him without any preamble, "Are you happy?" He was kneeling in the kitchen garden, which in recent years had expanded considerably under his management into a productive enterprise that supplemented the boarding house table significantly. He looked up at her. She was watching him with that steady attention she brought to the most important questions, the ones she had been thinking about long enough to ask directly. "Yes," he said. He said it without qualification, without the reflex toward irony or reservation that had characterized him when he arrived in this town. Completely. She looked at him for a moment more, reading him with the accuracy she had always been capable of. "Good," she said. He put down the trowel and went to sit beside her on the bench. Clara slept on in her arms, entirely unconcerned with the adult business of happiness. George and James were visible through the back fence in the alley, engaged in some project with a great deal of energy and a stick. "Do you ever think about that morning?" he said. "The morning I was leaving," she smiled. "You were very determined to go," she said. "I had a plan," he said. "You had a direction," she said. "That is not the same thing as a plan." "I had $37 and a very good horse," he said. "Pepper is in excellent health," she said. "He seems to have no complaints." He laughed. Pepper had been retired from the freight work 2 years ago, and now lived a life of considerable comfort in the Marsh and Hale stable, where Tommy spoiled him with exceptional feed, and where the 2 horses of the freight team regarded him with the polite deference owed to a senior employee. He was a fine old horse, and he would live many more years, and he deserved every comfort. "I think about that morning," Lionel said. "I think about the fact that I almost did not stop in the general store. I was going to go straight to the livery and ride out. But I needed supplies and I went in, and then I walked into you in the doorway, and then I could not." He paused, trying to articulate the thing. "I could not complete the motion. It was like something stopped working in the mechanism of leaving." "I know what that is," she said. "What is it?" "Arriving," she said. "Some people spend their whole lives moving towards something without recognizing it when they get there. You were at the right place and you almost left before you could see it." He looked at her, at his wife, at the mother of his children, at the woman who had asked him what he was running from, and waited, with infinite patience and absolute clarity, for him to find out the answer. He thought about the road to Wellington, about composing imaginary conversations with her during the drive, and coming home to have them, about the porch in October cold, about the garden in August heat, about the needlework on the wall of the room that said "make something of this day," about first snow, about all of it, the whole accumulated architecture of this life that had been built out of the single decision to stay. He put his arm around her shoulders carefully, not to disturb Clara, who was still deeply and contentedly asleep. He pressed his lips to her temple. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" she said. "For asking a question that I could not walk away from," he said. She leaned into him, the warmth and the weight of her familiar and irreplaceable. "You were always going to find out eventually," she said. "It would have just taken longer without the question. I would have been in Wichita doing something moderately useful and permanently dissatisfied," he said. "Probably," she agreed. Clara stirred in her arms, made a small searching sound, and settled again. Across the fence, George's voice rose briefly in the confident announcement of some discovery or position, and James replied in the equally confident tone of someone prepared to debate the matter thoroughly. The afternoon was warm, and the Kansas sky was its enormous, undiminished self above them, and the boarding house stood solid at their backs, and the supply business was sound, and the roof over the Harmon family's heads was in its 7th year and not showing any signs of failing, and the record of what had been done with Crofton's fraud was formal and real, and in the Federal Archive, and Lionel Hale, who had ridden into this town on a hot August afternoon in 1878 with every intention of leaving by nightfall, sat in the garden he had built beside the woman he loved more than any place or any motion or any previous version of himself, and felt the clean, unambiguous weight of a life that had become exactly what it was supposed to be. He had not left by nightfall. He had stayed for first snow, and second snow, and all the snows thereafter, and he intended to stay for everyone that followed, and that intention was the strongest and most honest intention he had ever formed, stronger by far than the one he had ridden in with, because it was built not on escape but on arrival, not on emptiness but on everything that choosing to stay had filled him with. And on the last warm afternoon of that spring, with his wife beside him and his children nearby and his name on a business and his hand still strong enough for any roof that needed fixing, Lionel Hale looked up at the enormous Kansas sky and understood, with the full and peaceful certainty of a man who has finally settled into his truest self, that this was the place, this was the life, this was the thing he had been moving toward through all the years of motion without knowing it. This was home. And it had begun, as the best things do, with one simple question from a woman who already knew the answer and was simply waiting for him to find it too.